Fungi friends, I'm going to be reading here from the book Have a Good Trip, Exploring the Magic Mushroom Experience by Eugenia Bone. So this is a great book that came out. I've read a few parts of it here on live, but I wanted to read the second part of the second chapter, which is all about how psilocybin as a molecule affects your brain. And I want to be really, really clear before I start reading that this is a published book. There's nothing illegal in the way that I'm going to talk about this. I'm literally just reading the words off a page. And none of this is a endorsement to go out and try any of this stuff. I'm simply educating you on the basic chemistry that has been laid out by this very well-respected author who did a lot of research on the subject. And I think it's important that we talk about it and learn about it. But because of the taboo and somewhat illicit nature of this molecule, it makes it really difficult to have a conversation about it. Excuse me, my cat is, there you go. Okay, buddy. All right. He may come back in the middle of reading. We'll see. He's a fuzzy orange cat. He's very friendly. But okay. So this is Have a Good Trip, Exploring the Magic Mushroom Experience by Eugenia Bone, Chapter 2, which is called Brain on Mushrooms, and this is the second part, continuation of what I had read previously. So, the psilocybin experience. In general, you will likely start feeling the effects 20 to 40 minutes after ingestion. The effects will intensify over the next 60 to 90 minutes, peak for a few hours, the wind down for another hour or two. In my experience, it's about 2 hours you sort of hit peak, and after that, within 4 to 6 hours, you're mostly back to normal. As I've mentioned, a magic mushroom trip typically lasts 4 to 6 hours, though 8 hours is not unusual, and the drug is evacuated from your system in about 15 hours. So again, all of these are just written words from a book. I'm not doing or saying anything illegal, and I hate that I have to continue to make these disclaimers, but that is the nature of the internet and how content moderation works. So, according to Stanislav Grof, a psychiatrist and a seminal researcher in the use of psychedelics for psychological healing, a tripper's consciousness consists of a sensory stage where you experience hallucinations, going deeper, a psychodynamic stage composed of memories or past experiences, sometimes traumatic ones. Deeper still, a perinatal stage that includes death and rebirth, and deepest, a transpersonal stage, when trippers no longer occupied with herself, writing as Eugenia, acquires a sense that there is a beyond. You won't necessarily experience all or any of these stages or in that order, but my observation is that the higher the dose, the deeper you plunge into your consciousness. However, the higher the dose, the likelier you will experience some kind of anxiety, too. Psychedelic trips are entirely subjective and dose dependent, so it's impossible to say definitively that X will happen and Y won't. But I can share with you the range of effects people have reported experiencing from onset to peaking to coming down, and where it applies, what it was like for me. Again, Eugenia's words. Onset. During the onset of a trip, that first half hour or so, it's common to feel an accelerated heartbeat, skin flushing, the shakes and shivers, and to experience yawning, giggles, headaches, or nausea. Lots of people vomit. For me, it's always the same. My heart starts thumping, and I get the chills, which are like the postpartum shakes I experienced after childbirth. I also feel a little, some people feel very, anxious, a queasy feeling somewhere between mild nausea and worry, where I question whether this is really something I want to do. I find this is a good time to remind myself that a trip is temporary. In my experience, it feels a little bit like going up on a roller coaster. And the problem is, you don't know how high that roller coaster is going to go, because once you start dropping, it could be a little disconcerting because reality is shifting around you. And again, that's part of why she wrote this book, to help people understand and contextualize their experiences in a very kind of academic way, because the more we talk about this, the safer people can be when they choose to explore using a substance like this. My cat is swatting at me. Yo, Honey Badger, can you chill, dude? Let me see if I can grab him. He's all activated. You're all wonky. Okay. As long as you don't swat at me while I'm in the middle of trying to talk, we're okay. But he is trying to eat the blanket. Okay. Peaking. Once the experience is in full swing, a lot of different kinds of things can happen. Your pupils dilate as big as black olives, which can make your eyes sensitive to light. Honey Badger, dude, chill. Just chill, bro. He is dude. He like wants to eat this blanket. Sorry for the disruption of our reading program, but let's see if I can show you guys the cat just so you have a visual on this. There he is. Honey Badger, can we see your face? All right, there you go. Yeah, he's out. Homie, I'm not digging this right now. You're being real. That's what I get for trying to go live. Okay. Peaking. Once the experience is in full swing, a lot of different kinds of things can happen. Your pupils dilate as big as black olives, which can make your eyes sensitive to light. Aches and pains may disappear only to come back as the trip concludes. Prior to one trip, I had been suffering from neck pain for weeks. It was a relief when the pain melted away as my trip intensified. When the pain returned, I knew I was heading back to reality. Trippers may laugh and they may sob. I once shared a seat on the bus to Burning Man Festival in Nevada with a bouncy gal from Southern California. I asked her if she intended to do mushrooms. No way, she said. Last year I took mushrooms hoping to have a euphoric experience on the playa, the alkaline lake bed where the festival takes place. Ended up crying in my tent the whole time. This year I'm taking MDMA. Some trippers may behave in irrational ways that can be alarming. Stripping, threatening themselves or others, peeing on the floor, or becoming despondent. One person who posted on R Shrooms wrote himself a bad trip note in anticipation. I think of just these kinds of symptoms. In the note, he reminded himself he was tripping, that the trip would pass, and to start thinking positively. Since I wrote it myself, he noted in a comment, it helps me believe I'll be okay since I always trust in sober me. Visual distortions are typical. Technically, a hallucination is defined as perceptions arising from the absence of external reality. Extreme open-eye hallucinations, like mistaking a plastic bag for your cat, are less likely with psychedelic mushrooms, but can occur, especially in very high doses. In my experiences, most of it feels sort of like looking at like a magic eye poster, like things look normal, but if you let your eyes kind of relax and you just let your brain go wild, suddenly you start to see patterns and shapes and things that aren't necessarily there in your field of vision. So it's fun to, like, I love being in nature because, you know, the trees to me always end up looking like kind of like they're dancing as they sway in the wind, and I listen to music. So she's sort of saying you don't normally get like open eye, like the clock is melting on the wall kind of thing unless you take a very high dose. And again, we're reading here from Have a Good Trip by Eugenia Bone. It's a great academic assessment of psilocybin and the effects that these mushrooms can have on the brain. And that's what she's talking about, is the sort of the arc of a trip right now and how that impacts your body and your physiology. But what mostly happens when you are tripping with eyes open is sensory distortions of what is already there. Trippers may see rainbows and spectrums and colors saturated, radiating with energy. You may see the world through fractals, lattices, honeycombs, tunnels, funnels, and spirals. Patterns may emerge from staring at a grassy lawn at Pebbly Road, and I've watched clouds develop symmetrical patterns, constantly changing like a kaleidoscope in shades of white and pink and gray. Order emerged from the chaos of the cloud forms, manifesting a kind of natural geometry like seashells and snowflakes. And I felt an awesome sense that a universal order underlay everything in nature. You might find yourself attracted to and curious about all manner of things in your environment, and you may see them in a different light, affording insights into the complexity of the natural world. On psilocybin, things I don't normally notice, like the solar tracking of daisies, become seeable, a staggering reminder of how alive they are. So that's a great kind of point, is that you become more hyper aware of little things in nature that maybe you notice, the way that like a sunflower attracts the sun, but you don't normally think about it until suddenly like you're on mushrooms and you're watching this entire field of sunflowers, tracking with the sun, kind of thing. That's kind of what she's getting at. So someone had asked how much this book is. I'm not sure. It's 20 something bucks. Look online. It's available on every major retailer. So it's called Have a Good Trip by Eugenia Bone. She's one of my favorite authors, and I'm going to do an interview with her probably next week. It's part of why I'm trying to make sure I actually read her book, because I've seen her talk about it, but I want to read the whole thing before we have a conversation. On higher doses, significantly stronger effects may occur. You may experience visual distortions like liquefying walls or items changing size. With closed eyes or in the dark, you may find yourself watching memories from your past, or scenarios may play out like in a dream. One tripper told me about encounters with shimmering animals in a forest who spoke with him. Another described being inside a spiral architecture, like the Guggenheim Museum in New York, where on the walls films played scenes from her life that she could stop and watch. I've heard stories of trippers seeing masses of threads or ropes, each representing a storyline in their lives, or a story they tell themselves about their lives that they could pull to reveal. These stories may include conversations with entities, sometimes wise and beneficent, or sometimes harsh, malevolent, or intimidating. Many people will speak of conversations or interactions with elfish beings that they interpret as the mushroom itself, or with the Mazatec Sabia, or wise woman Maria Sabina, called the Holy Children, or the Little Saints. Trippers may have a heightened sense of smell, taste, or touch. They may have auditory distortions and enhancements of sound already present. One person on Psychonaut Wiki described hearing their hair when they ran their fingers through it. In a group trip at night, I couldn't see anything, but I could hear other people in the large, dark room swallowing, rustling, breathing, sniffing, murmuring, all the sounds drawn out and modified in a low wah wah. I couldn't tell if they were near or far. I felt surrounded by a thick, muffled wall of random human sounds. I found I could focus on one voice and hear that voice intimately. A woman reciting prayers to herself in Spanish. Another who was having trouble breathing through her nose. It felt a little like spying. So then she talks about synesthesia and time warps. Another typical tripping experience is synesthesia. Synesthesia is the a phenomenon of experiencing one sense through another, where you might hear shapes, see tastes, taste colors, and feel smells. It's pretty weird, but it's what it is. Synesthesia isn't exclusively an effect of psychedelics. An example of non-drug-induced synesthesia is grapheme color synesthesia, where letters or numbers or even musical notes are perceived as colored. In the tiny percentage of people who experience non-drug-induced synesthesia, the effects are quite consistent. For them, if the number 4 appears red, it'll always look that way. The phenomenon is not really understood, but is thought to arise from cross-wiring between processing segments of the brain that are not normally networked, just what seems to be happening when you are tripping. Some scientists have proposed that all of us may start out life synesthetic, but as we mature, the brain settles into fewer, more efficient pathways. And indeed, the fMRIs of brains of some people diagnosed with autism, the brains of people tripping on psilocybin, and the brains of young children all show higher activity between regions of the brain than the neurotypical, the adult, and the sober. There's a little note down here. It says, a study in 2013 found that synesthesia occurs more often in autistic people than the general population and is associated with high serotonin levels present in about 25% of autistic people. Perhaps psilocybin excitation of serotonin receptors is, in the case of synesthesia anyway, analogous to naturally high serotonin levels in the brain, which might be a cause behind some of the autistic symptoms that people experience. I think that's an interesting thought experiment, especially if you yourself have any degree of autism or sort of non-neurotypical behavior in your brain. Neural connections in the typical adult mind seem to be more streamlined. There are fewer connections between regions and within regions of the brain, but they are strong and fast. Think of adult neural pathways as a network of superhighways linking regions of the brain, in contrast to the meandering footpath of a child's neural connections. That efficiency is beneficial in many ways. It saves energy and promotes focus, but also affects how we perceive time. It's typical for one sense of time to be warped while tripping. A trip often seems way longer than the 6 hours or so it takes for the drug to wear off. A short walk can seem to take forever, but then when you aren't tripping anymore, it will turn out to be no distance at all. That's happened to me many times in the mountains. I will walk and walk and walk in search of the perfect spot to have my experience, but eventually get so tired and overwhelmed, I just plop down on the edge of the trail. After the effects subside and it's time to head home, I always psych myself up for what I expect to be a long hike. Inevitably, it's a matter of yards. Mark Whitman, a neuropsychologist at the Institute for Frontier Areas of Psychology and Mental Health in Germany, is the author of many papers on time perception and the book Altered States of Consciousness, Experiences Out of Time and Self. He and his colleagues have documented that time perception is closely affiliated with mood states like boredom, stress, or excitement. You have experienced this before. When you're bored by the same old, time drags. When you're stimulated by something new, time flies. That's because our brains don't spend capital recording redundant memories. A widely reproduced finding shows that adults, regardless of culture, perceive time as passing faster the older they get. This may be because, based on prior experience, the brain constantly makes predictions about what might happen next. This is part of why when you travel, things seem so much more sort of lively and your time feels so much more full because you are clocking all of these experiences during travel as like a novel experience instead of just like sitting at home on another weekend, waiting for Sunday to pass and getting the Sunday dreads because Monday's coming kind of thing. Your brain is filling in with predictions what is going to happen, which is not as much fun as when you're traveling and experiencing lots of new stuff. Those predictions become increasingly frequent as we get older and develop more routines, leading to a reduced autobiographical memory load. The brain doesn't rewrite predicted memories, suggested David Engelman, who studies the neural mechanisms of time perception. When you are a child and everything is novel, the richness of memory gives the impression of increased time passage. For example, when looking back at the end of a childhood summer, think of a lot of memories you had in the summer as a kid, and for me now as an adult, like summers feel like they're over in the blink of an eye. But for adults, summers seem to pass faster and faster. However, a tripping adult brain records experiences more similarly to that of a child's, which is true, certainly experienced. When tripping, you feel much more in like a state of childlike wonderment and maybe clocking new experiences in a more childlike state. Things seem more novel and exciting to you. Time may slow down for the tripper because psilocin acts on the serotonin system, and the genes that regulate serotonin system are also related to time perception. At the beginning of a trip, Dr. Whitman told me, you have a state of hyper-mindfulness, and time slows down. Looking back, you may have so many memories of what happened, you think the trip lasted very long. But in between, at least with a high dose, you may also lose the sense of time of passage altogether. When we travel, maybe the days seem so full and long because our brains are busy recording new experiences. Similarly, a psychedelic trip really is like taking a trip. Both experience types present the opportunity for novel perceptions that our brains expend energy recording, or to look at it another way, both experiences upend our brain's predictive edge, and both operate on serotonin pathways. Indeed, after a psychedelic trip, my brain feels like it does after I spent the day sightseeing and wandering around museums. Well stimulated, right? Insights and revelations. During a trip, one can drift in and out of awareness from a trance-like state to a lucid one. I once popped out of a trance to realize I'd been staring at the sun. Disconcerting, but no harm done. You may feel increased empathy for others, including animals and natural systems, even for yourself. For many weeks, I sat in on meetings of the autistic psychedelic community. I learned that one of the reasons why folks in the society take psilocybin is to absolve themselves. Sometimes when an autistic person expresses their true self, they're socially rejected, and that damages their self-confidence. It is, as one person in the group described it, crushing. The drug helps them feel empathy towards themselves and to find self-acceptance. You may experience insights into how you interact with others, society, and nature, and those insights may come with a powerful sense of truth, as if you knew this truth all along, but never realized it before. The predominant feeling during a session, wrote James Fadiman, a longtime researcher into psychedelics, is not of discovering something new, alien, or foreign, but of recalling and reuniting with an unassailable clarity that has been latent in one's own mind. And I think that's a really important point, because when I've experienced this kind of trip, it's not like I'm somehow rehashing new stuff. It's that I'm like running through the passages of my own mind, and sometimes like running into things or re-experiencing things that I had forgotten about, and maybe seeing some of those experiences in a new light. And often that is a positive experience, which helps you gain perspective, or potentially even let go of old things that your brain is still rehashing. So, as she says, these insights can have lasting benefits. A scuba diver instructor I know ate mushroom-infused chocolate when he was 18. He didn't know how much psilocybin was in it, but soon he realized he needed to be in a safe place, and so decided to just drive home. On the drive, the drug came on strong. Buildings on the street stretched and grew, folded over, darkening the sun. He became panicky, and then he realized, I have two paths here. One is to succumb to the panic, wreck the car, maybe go to the hospital. The other is to stay calm and get home safely. He decided to stay calm, and he did. I realized it is in those moments when the body experiences panic that I need to keep my head the most. And that had a ripple effect in my life. Panic is really, well, he should have just pulled over, gotten a ride home. That was dumb. But yes, keeping your head level when you're experiencing something kind of panic-inducing is really important, especially as a scuba diver when you're underwater. That is very important. I realized it is one of those moments when the body experiences panic that I need to keep my head the most, and it had ripple effects in my life. Panic is a really bad thing when someone is deep in the water, but I know how to sit with whatever is coming up for a client. I know I can choose in my head to take the calm path and help them do the same. So that's good for a scuba diver instructor, but it's irresponsible for him to do that. Tripping creates a kind of hybrid consciousness where I am aware but in a fantasy. It is a state of metacognition, which sounds like a superpower, but is simply thinking about how I'm thinking. I can objectively observe myself having internal dialogues. The drug allows me to see right through me and subsequently realize why I do some of the things I do. But the opposite can happen too. It's possible to misunderstand what you are feeling, which can lead to anxiety. For example, becoming super conscious of your breathing might lead to hyperventilating or feeling like you are suffering an asthma attack. This happened to a fellow I know. He only started to feel better when his facilitator coached him through slow breathing. During one trip, I had to pee, but in my mind, I pathologized the feeling and became convinced I had a bladder infection. I didn't. That's fairly common. Sometimes people freak out, and you're like, hey, you just need to go to the bathroom. Go do that, and then they feel much better. Under a strong dose, or a dose that is strong for you, it's possible to even experience memory blanks and not recognize where you are, who you're with, or even who you are. One woman who experienced this told me, all of a sudden, I didn't know who I was or who my boyfriend was or where we were. And I just remember being so worried that I was going to be stuck in that state forever and end up locked in a psychiatric asylum. But less strong doses, like those I've preferred, allow me to do everything I needed to do. I might gaze trance-like at a landscape for a while, but when I felt the need to pee, I could pull myself together and find a private bush. And that's another good one. Because in this book, she talks a lot about, like, take the right dose for the kind of experience you want to have, and don't, like, overdose yourself and put yourself into a state where you are incapable of, like, handling something like going to the bathroom and then thinking that you have a bladder infection. You know, that's not part of a good trip. That's, you know, things that could be part of a bad trip, for example. So again, her point is take the amount for the the dose for the kind of experience you want to have and remove any risk factors, which might also mean like, hey, have someone around who's sober who can like guide you to a bathroom if you need to pee, right? What so many people who experiment with magic mushrooms are hoping for are personal revelations. The 10 years of therapy in 6 hours effect. Hypothetically, during the course of a trip, the parts of the brain involved in ego, the default mode network, is generally considered the culprit. So the parts of the brain are temporarily disengaged or differently engaged. Perhaps this leads to a breakdown of the ego constructs we built over the course of our lives to excuse or explain away behaviors, including long-established opinions and judgments. And free of those ego constructs, some trippers gain insights into themselves. For example, on an afternoon trip with a large group of middle-aged people, one man dredged up a memory about a soured business deal, and he told me he'd realized he'd done a partner wrong. He'd kept that inside for a long time. I know what it feels like to carry guilt, but be unable, for whatever reason, to resolve it. I spent plenty of time justifying past actions in lieu of resolving some guilty feeling. A kind of, I did this because I did this, legitimizing my behavior. I have a portfolio of such episodes in my life. But what the drug seems able to do is help you set aside the narrative that stops you from seeing what the real cause of the problem is, and that can feel like a revelation. It's good advice. Insights that happen on trips don't always have to do with personal issues. Sometimes they can be about work or an aid to solving problems. A special education teacher told me about a mushroom trip that helped her reach one of her students in a new, and it turns out, effective way. He was clearly delayed, but also distant and disgruntled, and often distraught. He spent much of his time in class hiding under his desk. We were very concerned, and nothing seemed to help. One evening, she and some other faculty gathered to take mushrooms. The bulk of the evening was spent in uproarious laughter, which was something we needed. But toward the end, work life inevitably crept in their conversation, and I asked my colleagues if they thought this puzzling child just needed space to play and work through some of the emotional burdens that seemed to be hindering his progress. The moment of clarity led to her switching the child from classroom work to a social emotional playgroup for a little while. I had the child start coming in with a few other students 3 days a week to play different cooperative games, to draw and to play with a dollhouse together, and the effects were astounding. He's a gifted artist and really shined during our drawing sessions, and even started teaching the other kids a few of his skills. His self-confidence grew, he had buddies, and felt more at home. After 6 weeks, he was ready to go back to working on his academic goals. He was like a new kid. Trippers may experience many such insights at a time during a trip, and those insights are often coupled with an indubitable sense that they are true. While insights and revelations are ultimately personal, there's one that seems to be widely shared, an incontrovertible awareness that we are connected to everything in nature. This insight is often associated with ego dissolution and the transpersonal state. Ego dissolution. Trippers often report a sense that everything around them is alive. Obviously, trees are alive, but do we regularly sense their life? Once during a trip, I sensed the landscape respiring, a breathing in and out. I started to breathe with the landscape too, and I felt a distinct and lovely sensation that everything I could see was as alive as I was. And all of this in a kind of glorious syncopation. I think that means sort of harmony. Some trippers interpret this feeling of connectedness with nature as a mystical experience, the result, perhaps, of so-called ego dissolution, aka ego death, ego loss, ego disintegration, a loss of subjective self-identity. The authors of the paper, Ego Dissolution Psychedelics, describe it as an experience of depersonalization and derealization. It can feel very good or very bad, something welcomed or something fought against. Ego dissolution is likelier to occur with large doses, and some people can take large doses because they want to experience it. It can run the gamut from blissful to terrifying, from nature-related to experiencing one's own death and rebirth, even experiences of multi-dimensionality, where one perceives everything is everything at once, or conversely, absolutely nothingness. There are many ways to describe ego dissolution. I like one from Gurn, a neuroscientist who hosts the Psychedelic Scientist YouTube channel. He described the ego as a combination of the embodied self, which is one sense of self-experience, what we experience with our bodies, and the autobiographical self, which is related to the narratives we tell ourselves about ourselves, our identities, our life stories. In a psychedelic trip, those self-identities dissolve. Our autobiographical selves lose track of how we describe who we are, and our embodied selves lose their boundaries and merge with the world around us, so the sense of being distinct from nature melts. We are left, he said, with this unitive consciousness where there is an undifferentiated awareness of all that is occurring without feeling like we are just a distinct person from experiencing it. And that is that sort of like oneness and sense of nature that you can feel when you take this drug. And it's a pretty incredible sensation to, like, you know, you go outside and you know everything's alive, but suddenly when you realize that you are part of it and you feel like the earth is breathing and you're breathing along with it, you feel a lot more connected to nature. And I think that's a very valuable experience for people. So again, I'm reading from the book Have a Good Trip by Eugenia Bone. This is chapter 2, describing your brain on mushrooms and what the duration and experiences of a trip is like. Coming down. You will probably know when you have emerged from the strongest part of the trip. With the cessation of effects, I felt a growing sense of my old self is back. It felt safe and yet slightly disappointing, like I was on my way home after a big adventure. Others have told me they felt relief that the ordeal was almost over. You may continue to have significant personal insights when your trip ends, but without the distractions of hallucinatory or dissociative states. Coming down from a trip can be euphoric, with well feelings of emotion, love, and gratitude, or relief, even if the trip wasn't stressful. It's a time when I write my husband love texts. I seem to recall blowing kisses to thanks to various trip sitters. I always cry, happy, overwhelmed, tears like a child does when they receive a birthday gift they've yearned for. But I've never had a bad trip. Barring those who've had devastating trips where their fears or worries linger if they have caused harm to themselves or others during the trip, most people do not experience after effects, although some may feel worn out or depressed, have a headache, or suffer sleep issues from night terrors to insomnia. Coming down is often associated with body sensations. I felt the desire to stretch, to sit up, to look around anew, and waves of cozy feelings, as if I am snuggling under the covers. You may feel sensitive or vulnerable, or compelled to share your experience right away. After a trip, I always feel introverted. At the conclusion of a routine experience where I had tripped with a group in a yoga studio, a woman from Long Island plunked herself at the end of my mat to unload, but I couldn't follow, and I was so totally inarticulate I could only smile and nod and let out an occasional wow when she paused for my response. It might take you days or months after a trip to process any insights. It is not uncommon for those insights to reappear in your mind with greater clarity as time goes on. At a ceremony held by a Mazatec shaman, we were advised to avoid alcohol, sex, and extravagant financial expenditures for 4 days after our trip to keep the experience introspective and give ourselves time to digest. Nor is it uncommon to recall your trip vividly for years afterwards. I distinctly remember the details of the trip, which is good because the notes I wrote are utterly unintelligible. In some cases, trippers who have a neurological event, like blacking out weeks after the trip, can experience intense worry that their trip was somehow responsible. I've talked to a few people who have experienced this, and it is a torment. But it is also difficult to prove psilocybin was the cause. One fellow I know had a stressful trip and 2 weeks later drove a rental pickup truck across 2 lanes of oncoming traffic without speeding up, braking, or swerving into someone's living room. He came to after hearing sirens and finding himself sitting in a demolished truck with 3 airbags deployed. He spent the next 18 months trying to figure out what happened. Enduring tests by neurologists, seeking advice from traditional Chinese medicine doctors and psychotherapists, who eventually diagnosed the event as dissociation with amnesia, but whether that was a result of taking mushrooms, he can't know. Sometimes, he wrote me, things come together that cannot be anticipated or explained. It may not be surprising to hear that many people are in no rush to trip again, and some never do. Others may feel they've got a grip on the experience after the first trip, only to find the next time around they did not. I got slapped, one woman told me. It's like the mushroom said, nope, you don't got this. People trip in all kinds of patterns. I am affiliated with an annual tripping group whose participants change slightly from year to year. I know folks who have tripped several times in a short period and then called it quits, and others who trip the way some people drink martinis. However frequently the experience is approached, according to the philosophical entertainer Alan Watts, if you get the message, hang up the phone. For psychedelic drugs are simply instruments, like microscopes, telescopes, and telephones. The biologist does not sit with eye permanent glued to the microscope. He goes away and works on what he has seen. And I think that's a great point, is that taking these kinds of things is just a tool. And, you may use it for a brief period of time. You might do it, once a year. You might do it more often if you have something that you're working through. But it is just a tool, and it's not something that you have to constantly do. In fact, it's certainly not a substance that you feel any desire to do daily. It's not like a cup of coffee. It's not something addictive. And for the most part, you feel relatively sated after trying them. So it's got a very low potential for addiction and abuse because of that. Is psilocybin therapeutic? The short answer is it can be, though it's far from being totally understood. Researchers have associated psilocybin-induced ego dissolution with decreases in depression, anxiety, and existential distress for some people. The prevailing hypothesis is that ego dissolution occurs when the default mode network is downregulated, as it seems to be during a trip. And since the DMN is strongly related to the narrative self, said Dr. Whitman, the downregulation of the DMN or decrease of the DMN interaction with the rest of the brain would be related to a reduced narrative self. This could be a decisive step towards a total ego dissolution. Personal insights that arrive with deep certainty may arise from psilocybin-induced ego dissolution. Peter Hendricks is a gregarious and jolly family man who studies psilocybin and a range of addiction, anxiety, and other disorders at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. He explained to me that most, if not all, mental health problems may be understood as a form of pathological self-focus. Not necessarily narcissistic, but one's own daily experience becomes highly focused on the self. So the addicted person may be fixated on using the chronic pain sufferer. The chronic pain sufferer is fixated on their pain. The person dealing with an end-of-life prognosis is fixated on their mortality. When we ingest psilocybin, Dr. Hendricks said, it promotes chaotic, hyper-associative cognition. Your field of awareness opens. That's when people have moments of awe, and you aren't thinking about yourself anymore. You become small relative to your expanded sense of reality, and liberated from those nagging, self-directed thoughts, you're able to make the connection we call insights. Insights may be therapeutic. For some, ego dissolution is a spiritual experience, and that can have therapeutic ramifications as well. The paper, Psilocybin Produces Substantial and Sustained Decreases in Depression and Anxiety in Patients with Life-Threatening Cancer, a randomized double-blind trial, reported on patients who answered questions about how personally meaningful their trip was, how spiritually significant, and 5 weeks later, how depressed or anxious they felt. The study showed that the more spiritually significant and meaningful the trip was, the less anxiety and depression the patient reported. Other studies have shown psilocybin-induced mystical experiences, when combined with the patient's own spirituality, produce positive changes in their attitudes, including how they relate to others. Okay. Other ways psilocybin may be therapeutic. Another factor that may explain psilocybin's potential efficacy as a therapeutic drug is psilocybin-induced neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to strengthen, loosen, and reorganize its connections. Psilocybin may change serotonergic pathways that have been altered by traumatic experiences like those some veterans have encountered. It may also do this by inducing an acute hyperplastic state where the brain learns new things and then after the trip is over, leaves open a window of plasticity where new knowledge may be set, leading to positive neuroplasticity or serotonergic pathways that are symptom-free. Basically, new ways of thinking can be formed, and then you can sort of walk down those paths after a trip. And they don't have the same baggage or burden that your previous sort of worn-in ways of thinking do. And that can be very beneficial as a therapeutic way of thinking around your problems, basically. You've seen examples of neuroplasticity Within 48 hours, a newly hatched duckling will imprint on its mother duck or family dog, if that's who is there. After the window of attachment closes, children seem able to learn languages more readily than adults. That lasts until they are 5 or 6 years old, and thereafter languages are harder to learn. These are called critical periods of time when the brain is open to certain types of imprinting. It could be that psychedelics open critical periods of their own. A radical shift in your environment may open a critical period, explained Gul Dolan at Horizons, the 2022 psychedelic conference, like a stroke or psychedelic experience. Her work as a psychologist at Johns Hopkins University suggests that not only do psychedelics seem to open critical periods, but different psychedelics keep them open for different lengths of time. For psilocybin, she explained, the period lasts about 2 weeks after the trip, a period when, if coupled with therapy, people may experience changes in the structure or function of neural pathways that could relieve them of problematic symptoms. So it's not just the trip itself, but the integration and the management and the work you do after a trip that helps to reinforce some of the realizations or new ways of thinking. The new pathways you've created in your brain need to be tracked and followed to help imprint those new ways of thinking and avoid problematic ways of thinking that you practiced before. But this isn't always what happens. Sometimes the drug seems to reinforce problematic serotogenic pathways. I have spoken with a few folks whose negative self-talk acquired added agency during the trip. Yes, the mushrooms seem to say, you are an awful person. The psychological risks are real. It's a powerful experience, and without crucial integration in a non-drug setting, it can be disturbing and ask more questions than are answered, said Ben Sessa, a charismatic psychiatrist and psychedelic researcher from the UK. He believes therapy can play an important role in helping patients integrate their experience and learn from it, or in the case of a bad trip, recover from it. So, this is the book, Have a Good Trip, Exploring the Magic Mushroom Experience by author Eugenia Bone. It's a really good look at magic mushrooms, their chemistry, how they've been used by humans, the impact of psychedelics in society, facilitation, people who do facilitating like experiences, as well as like places that sort of offer, retreats and things like that. And she takes a critical look at all of these things. So this is not celebrating magic mushrooms and sort of just espousing all the amazing things they do. This is a very well-written, like journalistic documentation of the field as a whole, and then also cautions a lot of things like bad trips, which is what the whole next chapter is about, is bad trips and what can go wrong in a trip. And I think that's an important one to read and think about as well, because often magic mushrooms are being portrayed as entirely positive, and just like anything else, they can be good or bad depending on the person and the situation. So go and check out the book, Have a Good Trip by author Eugenia Bone. I think it's a really interesting one, and hopefully you guys enjoyed listening to this. So I will sign off now, but hope everyone has a wonderful day, and see you next time, fungi friends.